Tēnā koutou katoa kua hui mai nei I tēnei pō. Me karakia tuatahi tātou. Tuia I runga, tuia I raro, tuia I waho, tuia I roto. Tuia te hari tangata, ka rongo te pō, ka rongo te ao. Haumi e, hui e, tāiki e. Whaia te iti ka hurangi ki te tūauhu koe me he maunga teitei. Kei te mihi ki te tangata whenua o Aotearoa. He tiaki e te whenua, te moana, te tai ao katoa. Kei te mihi ki ngā kai kōrero o te pō nei, he toha I o rawa mā tauranga. Kei te mihi ki a koutou, he whakarongo, he whakaako me te kaupapa ki te hāpai, I te rangi Māori, monorongo I te whenua. Welcome everyone to the No Space for War webinar. I would like to acknowledge the traditional guardians and protectors of Aotearoa's lands and waters who have never ceded sovereignty, in particular those people whose lands and waters are impacted by Rocket Lab's launch site on the Mahia peninsula and surrounding area, Ngā Hapu, a Rongo Mai Wahine, and Rakaipaaka. My name is Valerie Morse. I'm a member of Peace Action Wellington, and I'll be moderating the session tonight. Thanks to Eliana Derrick from Auckland Peace Action, who is doing the technical support behind the scenes. Tonight is about public education, raising awareness about the operations of Rocket Lab and creating an opportunity for some questions. It's also an opportunity for action. Auckland Peace Action has started a petition calling for an immediate end to Rocket Lab's launch of military payloads. I'm posting the link in the chat here, and we're asking you to sign the petition and to share it widely. Sorry, just see about my chat here. I'll get Aliana to post our various links for me. There's a national network that is formed, and we invite groups and individuals to get involved in that network if you would like to do further work. You can contact us for further info and sign up for regular updates, and we'll post all of that stuff in the chat. So turning to tonight's subject, concern about Rocket Lab has existed within the peace movement since its presence on the Mahia Peninsula became public in 2016. With investment by the world's largest weapons company, Lockheed Martin, there was cause for alarm and skepticism of its intentions from the outset. Our first speaker tonight is investigative journalist Ollie Neas, who's greatly contributed to public understanding of the company's work and its client base. We are enormously grateful to have him here with us to discuss the company and the upcoming launch of the Gunsmoke J satellite for the US military. We are also honored to have Sonya Smith with us. Sonya is Ngati Rakaipaaka and based in Wairoa. She has more than 25 years experience in healthcare with a background in nursing. She is one of the members of Rocket Lab Monitor, a new group of volunteers focusing on information collection and education. And we'll post the links to the Rocket Lab Monitor website, Facebook pages, and to the email address in the chat now. We're going to hear from each of them for about 15 to 20 minutes and then have some time for questions at the end. Please do stay muted. And if you'd like to ask a question or raise a point, you're welcome to send it through to the moderator on the chat. We'll have time for questions at the end of the kōrero. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be available to registered attendees at the conclusion. So thanks everyone for being here tonight. Ollie, I'll turn over to you first.
Kia ora koutou, everyone. Thanks very much, Valerie, for that introduction. As mentioned, I've been working as a journalist on this topic for a number of years, reporting on since late 2018, mainly for the spin-off, but also more recently for North and South magazine. I've not been invited here today just to give an overview of really what's going on. What do we know about what's happening, what actually is happening, what kind of oversight is there, and I'm happy to answer any questions people have to help clarify things. I imagine Rocket Lab people are aware in some way of what Rocket Lab is, but just to start at the very basics, what are we talking about here? So Rocket Lab, it's a space launch company. It launches satellites into space. So it's a bit like a company like SpaceX, but what makes Rocket Lab different is that it launches small satellites on small rockets into space. And this means that it can launch rockets into space faster, cheaper, and more quickly than any other company can. And so there's kind of two stories you hear about Rocket Lab. The first of those is one that I think most people have heard of, and is the most dominant one in the conversation around the company. And this is Rocket Lab is the Kiwi success story. You know, it's the story of this self-taught rocket engineer from Southland starting this company and bringing New Zealand into the space age. And it's the story of how this company will bring all these economic benefits to the country at large, and also specifically to Mahia. And it will bring all kinds of benefits more broadly for the planet. You know, its technology will help study climate change. It will improve internet access, all this kind of stuff. Now, that is all true in a way. You know, what we're talking about today is not that any of that is necessarily untrue, but it's only one side of the story here. So the other side of Rocket Lab is that since its early days, it has been a contractor for the US military. So this began around 10 years ago, that started undertaking contracts for a range of US military agencies, including doing contracts with explicit military applications. And as Valerie mentioned, its funders include Lockheed Martin, which is a major aerospace and military company. And also its investors include the CIA's venture capital firm, which invests in companies that are considered to benefit US intelligence agencies. And since it began its launches from Mahia in 2017 and 2018, it's turned New Zealand into a launching site for US military satellites. So to date, I think it's launched about US military or intelligence satellites on around 7 different missions. But it's one thing to say, okay, the military's involved here, but you know, what are we actually talking about? What actually is being launched? And this is where I think a lot of the kind of questions come in. I think just to start here, it's useful to have a bit of an understanding of how space fits into military operations. Because often what you hear being said, particularly from Rocket Lab, is we're not going to launch weapons. We're definitely not going to launch weapons. And then as if that finishes the conversation. But when we're talking about militaries in space, we're really not talking about, you know, war in space or necessarily putting weapons in space, although that is a concern some people have. But the kind of reality of it is how space is used to support military activity on Earth. So space infrastructure, so satellites, are the backbone to a whole range of military activity on Earth. So, you know, the US military relies on satellites for communications, communicating with troops, to surveillance and reconnaissance, so imaging the battlefield so they know where to put people, to intercepting communications, what you might call spying, to targeting weapons. So that's kind of what we're talking about. And increasingly small satellites of the kind Rocket Lab launches are being used by militaries because they allow you to put more satellites in more places. So the satellites launched so far by Rocket Lab for the military agencies primarily have been described as research and development or technology demonstration satellites. And this is a point that Rocket Lab makes often in defense of these launches. It says that, you know, these are not part of active military operations now. So the argument goes, we don't need to worry about it. And from the public information, for most of these launches, that does seem to be the kind of satellites we're talking about. In various parts of that space infrastructure that supports military operations. But there's a few, I think, important points to note about that. The first of those is that the government says that they expect that operational military or intelligence satellites will be launched at some point. So there's not a red line drawn there around research and development satellites. And for a number of these satellites, we don't actually know what they're doing. So we've launched several satellites for an agency called the National Reconnaissance Office, which is a major US intelligence agency. And these satellites are all classified, which means we're not allowed to know what they're doing, what their purpose is, or what their capabilities are. So there's a real question, I think, around those. What are they doing? Are they something that people are comfortable with? And the fact that New Zealand launched those is really significant because this is a major US intelligence agency. And until Rocket Lab launched those satellites, they'd never, ever launched satellites from outside the US. But then another important point to note is Rocket Lab's upcoming launch, which is due to lift off later this month, is of a experimental satellite, but is one that has raised a lot of questions. So this is a satellite called the Gunsmoke J, which belongs to the US Army's Space and Missile Defense Command. And the purpose of this satellite, according to statements from the US Army itself, is to improve US weapons targeting capabilities. So Rocket Lab's response has been, well, this is not a weapon itself. They say this is testing communication, but the clear purpose of those tests, according to the US Army, is to improve how information is transmitted from space to people on the battlefield to improve how weapons can be targeted. So this satellite, I think, is showing that there are a lot of questions as to where the boundaries are with what we're comfortable with. And I think is showing that even if it's a experimental satellite, there are many questions to ask. And the military remains a major focus for Rocket Lab. So some of you may have heard news in the last couple of weeks about Rocket Lab listing on the NASDAQ stock exchange in the US. It's now valued at, I think, around $6 billion. And it's expanding the range of the kinds of launches it does. But the documents it released to investors to encourage people to invest at that time shows that the military remains a major focus. Around 30% of their business is for the US military. And so certainly we can expect this to continue to be a conversation or an issue. For the rest of the time I've got to talk, I thought I'd just turn to the question of why are we launching these satellites and what kind of oversight is there? So there's an idea that I think a lot of people have around the New Zealand space industry, that politicians say and the space regulators say and that all kinds of people say, which is that New Zealand's space regime is for peaceful purposes. But the reality is that since the very beginning, there's been an expectation from the New Zealand government that it will be approving the launch of US military satellites. And this is primarily for two reasons. One is that military agencies are a major client of Rocket Lab. Rocket Lab is the reason we've got a space industry, and they rely on the military for revenue. And secondly is New Zealand's security relationship with the United States. So politicians and the government have seen this as an opportunity to integrate more closely with the US military, and they perceive that as bringing various benefits to New Zealand, quite controversially. But despite that, there was no public discussion about this. This wasn't put out to the public to get their views at the time the space regime was introduced. And in fact, there wasn't any discussion of it in any meaningful way until after the launch of these military satellites began in late 2018. And in fact, from the beginning, government officials have recognized that these launches are actually going to be really controversial. And so it's tried to find a way to reduce the risk of public pushback. And one of the ways it's done that is to try and find this line as to where the boundary is to launch US satellites, but to not go so as far to cause an outcry. But exactly where that red line is not public. So to give an overview of exactly how the oversight system works, and I'm sorry if this gets a bit legal, but essentially every satellite launched from New Zealand needs to be signed off by the Economic Development Minister, and that's currently Stuart Nash. And he receives advice on each satellite from the New Zealand Space Agency. they assess each satellite against New Zealand's legal criteria, and they make a recommendation. And as far as I'm aware, that there hasn't yet been a satellite that hasn't been approved. And under the law, the Outer Space Act, they have to consider, is the satellite, a risk to human safety? Is it an environmental risk? But then the minister is allowed to say no to a satellite if he considers it to not be in the national interest. And so the real question is, legally, is when it comes to US military launches, what is New Zealand's national interest? And understandably, that's very contentious. And what the government said is launching a nuclear weapon is not in our national interest. Okay, that's good to know, I guess. Launching satellites that will harm the environment, not in our national interest, good. But in a very ambiguous way, it says that it won't approve satellites that contribute to certain military programs that are against government policy. But of course, what that means is entirely unclear. So we've got this big gray area where we're launching military satellites. And as we can see later this month, we're launching satellites that contribute directly to improving US military weapons targeting capabilities. And yet we're told there's a red line, but we're not sure where that is. And so I think this upcoming launch later this month from Mahia of the Gunsmoke J payload is a real test for the New Zealand space regime, but more importantly, a test for where the New Zealand public stands on this. It's clear that for many people, there are real benefits here. And in the community in Mahia, from the people I've spoken to, that's clear. There's opportunities here, but there's also risks. And there's also big questions as to how does this align with our values? How far are we willing to go down the military path? And what do we want to do about it? So I think I'll pass it over to Sonya now to pick it up from there. But happy to answer any questions at the end, and I hope that's been helpful.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Wairoa, ko take tēmu toku waka, ko maumaka toku maunga tapu, ko nui haka toku awa. Ko Ngati Rakaipaaka, whakatohia, rongo mai wahine, Ngati Whenua ki te Wairoa ngā iwi, tēnā tātou katoa, ko Sonya Smith tēnei. Thank you. I want to mahia to the whānau Mahia Wairoa who've registered tonight, and all those across Aotearoa who've joined us. Yeah, so I was born in Wairoa when my parents were living at Tunanui Road at Morere. But by the time I was 5, we moved to Manituki, so all my schooling was done in Gisborne. But I've been living back in the Wairoa district for 15 years, working in the health sector. So my professional background is a nurse. I'm a mum, I'm a nanny of one mokopuna. I'm actually a farmer as well. I'm a paddler. I have no passion in waka or outrigger paddling, but I'm really passionate about the place I live and most of all the people. And I guess that sort of leads on to how we arrived here tonight. So how do we get to this space? I did hear about Ollie in 2009. He was conducting research around the Rocket Lab activity, with some of the concerns that he's already mentioned. At that time, I had some questions, but really I was just scratching the surface and not really knowing where to go with some of those concerns. Ollie's back in Mahia and impending article, which many of you would have read in North South just recently, this last week. And so once again, a bunch of us back together saying, hey, some things just aren't right here. And it was the article in the spin-off, the one headlined Controversial Rocket Lab Mission Designed to Prove US Military Targeting, that really tipped the balance. And so a decision was made from a group of us that we needed some kind of structure or construct to pick up information. We were finding more and more people had the same questions that we had. And how with the legislation, how with the consent process, how did we end up in this space? So that was the birthplace, Rocket Lab Monitor as a group, and also the website. So the website went live on the 15th of February, so not that long ago, and the Facebook page quickly followed. And then literally within weeks, we had police contact post the website, launch, which I didn't expect all that kind of reaction to happen so quickly. So, you know, there has been a massive groundswell. And then going on to, in the last couple of weeks, meeting with Tangata Whenua at Mahia, who really clearly have had their rights violated over a long period of time, who are the people who've been asking questions for a long period of time, are the people much closer and most affected. So some of the things that occurred at an earlier time that created concern. I was at a farming expo just over 12 months ago in Wairoa. The prelude to that, I was involved in trying to lead out a provincial growth fund application to extend our airport, and working with iwi groups in the council at that time. And then out of the blue, there was an announcement in the paper that Rocket Lab had provincial growth funding successfully, just over 6 million to have the road improved out there. So I said to the mayor, you know, what's going on? How does that happen? We've been planning and prioritising all the PGF applications out of Wairoa. He literally grabbed me by the arm and took me aside and whispered to me what had happened. He said it was a done deal. Peter Beck went straight to Jacinda and that was that. So let's not talk about it anymore. And, you know, I was pretty aghast. I was saying, how the heck does that happen in a democracy? How does that happen? You know, how do you exercise self-determination when you're against those sorts of things? I'd also asked one of our Tato leaders, you know, what happened? They were pictured in the newspaper alongside Rocket Lab with this big announcement. They also said, you know, that it was a done deal. They were just present on the day. So, you know, more questions being raised. Friends and whānau that were shareholders of the Tawapata block, I'd asked them, how did they benefit? You know, what does it mean for them? And most of them didn't have enough information. Some were very unhappy, but mostly they didn't seem informed about the activity or the agreements in place. So those are some of the questions. So we wanted to launch a website with the intention of supporting the questions that we had, the questions we knew other people had. People really, we saw, felt the same, particularly with shared concerns about the military payloads and this sort of unfettered, unboundaried approach, almost bordering on arrogance of Rocket Lab around Peninsula. Yeah, so that moved pretty quickly. So Rocket Lab Monitor was born. Our priority is to collect accurate information on Rocket Lab activities. And a lot of work that Ollie has done has fed into that in the initial phases. Also noting the legislation and the treaties so that you've got one place to go to pick up that information. Sharing information with the public, so some of the official Information Act requests that have come through. And also a lot of the consent stuff, because people are saying, how could this happen? How did we get this far? And so showing the consent process there. And we could talk a lot about that, but we won't tonight. It's filled with holes, really. And also to ensure any launches from Mahia comply with the legislation and are solely for peaceful purposes. So that's the website's intent. So this slide really talks about some of the feedback we've got from people that have connected the website. So there's definitely, you know, Tangata Whenua, there's whānau of Mahia who've utilised the website, and then there's other people too. And as you can see, there's questions there. Were local iwi co-opted, manipulated? How challenging is it to get your stories into corporate media? So, you know, these are some of the questions there. Also, the networks that are in place that are keen to support. There we go. We've got Pākehā there, 90 years old, wanting to support this movement and looking for the same sort of information that we were looking for. And then someone else just come across the site. Great to see that someone is doing what you're doing. Long time had concerns. So, you know, this feeling and these issues have been around for some time. So different people have different concerns. There's a lot of layers to this and a lot of levels of concern. So there's definitely a camp that's in love with rockets. sometimes the discussion over the morning tea table doesn't go down so well with those people. You know, how could this be wrong? And you can be shut down pretty quickly, particularly the people that see or perceive that there's a strong economic benefit locally in the area that's largely quintile 5 on the deprivation index. And, you know, people think, well, how can the New Zealand government be wrong? Sonya, you know, how can you say that? How could the minister, how could Jacinda, how could the, you know, it's legal, so it must be right. So there's people that, you know, have that belief system. And then there's a group of people who feel something is just not right. And I guess that's some of the feeling that we've had for some time and not getting the answers. They're not sure what to ask. And maybe it seems a bit technical, but it doesn't feel good. So where do I go with that feeling? Disappointment. Here's a quote from someone in Mahia. I'm really disappointed in Jacinda. How can a Labour government support military payloads? And yeah, so we have a Labour government that we say left, centre left, border and right, and then, you know, our national history in relation to peace and nuclear protests. So distrust, there's huge distrust. Peter Beck has misrepresented himself repeatedly, and he's been unwilling to engage in ways that he had initially promised. So at the I think it might have been the only meeting with shareholders, he very clearly said that if anything was going to change or happen, that he would be back to talk to them. Subsequent meetings were held at Mokotei Hall and then media press releases. So he hasn't stuck to those initial promises. And of course, the North-South article highlights it even more. And there's people in a place of regret that initially, you know, thought that this would be a great idea and the benefits would be realised, and unfortunately have now come back to say, actually, that hasn't played out the way that we thought it would. That's not what we signed up for. And, you know, some people want Rocket Lab gone altogether. You know, yep. So that's a very real position. So basic rights of engagement and access for tangata whenua and mana whenua have been transgressed. The North-South article highlights that again too. I think Wairoa gives a really good example about putting it back to Peter Beck. How would you feel if you couldn't even go to the dairy on the street that you live on? You know, where people collect kai, where people live in the exclusion zone, so they're required to evacuate. Cultural impacts have not truly been mapped, and the whānau at Mahia are really feeling that. So, you know, there've been the kaitiaki there, they've been undermined. There are people that are real champions for the environment, who've done a lot of work. And I have to admit, when I started to ask questions, I talked to my friends who are champions of the environment. They're really hot on water quality, clean water. They're really great at doing that sort of stuff, but aerospace is something else altogether. So that's not the typical issue we're used to dealing with. So I couldn't help but borrow Tama Iti's design t-shirt to put on this map of Mahia. You know, everyone wants a piece of Mahia, it feels, and you know, we've got a colonised story. We're a colonised people, and you know, it's been a huge journey. It's actually not a big piece of land when you look at it. 21 k's long, 12 k's wide. It's hugely steeped in history. There's lots of wahi tapu and urapa, particularly closer to the launch site at that end of the peninsula. It's a coastal haven. As I said, everyone wants a piece of it. Yeah, as Tama Iti says, you know, with colonisation, we must accept it to heal it. We're all colonised. So he knows it, you know it, we own it, we accept it, we heal it. So it's about understanding what's occurring for us now. So one of the complications with this is the launch site is on Māori land. I'm not personally a shareholder. There are shareholders I know that have registered tonight and will be listening. It's a land block that's at the tip of Peninsula, and then Portland or Waikawa Island goes out from there. I am a shareholder in different land blocks and corporations, and I find the structures and I guess the charters or constitutions, how this particular block is run has some unique factors to it. So often Māori land's a collection of blocks. That's nothing new. There is a legal framework there around the Ngati Whenua Act, which is unique in itself. There is a large amount of shareholders in this Tawapata block. And in this block, what's unique is, and not all Māori blocks and incorporations do this, you can design a constitution that's different, but in this one, it's about who's the largest share is proportionate vote, we'll say. And so there's a handful of people or whānau trusts that hold court, if you will, in a larger share. And the other thing I understand, and I'm happy to be corrected by anyone, is that it's an incorporated society as well. So that's another layer, another piece of governance in there. So typically the screenshot that I've taken there with the map, and it's got the trustees. Typically when you go to the Māori Land Court online, you would see all the shareholders and what have you. But in this case, with this block, that's held with the accountancy firm. But the trustees that you see there, they have been the decision makers. And yes, there has been trustees that have gone before them. And so that were involved at an earlier point when Rocket Lab was new to Wairoa. So I understand that it's initially the agreement was between the chairperson, the trust block's lawyer, and Rocket Lab and their legal team. So that's been one of the things that's left shareholders and other people disgruntled, is not the ability to see the lease, be part of the negotiation and so forth. So Peter Beck has met with the shareholders once, and as I've heard repeated times, promised that if there was going to be any announcements or anything different, that he would be back to that group. And that's one of those broken promises. So the modern day colonial story certainly has all the hallmarks of that. You know, colonisation involves the settlement of large number of settlers amongst the subject people. That's probably not so much a big deal. The other one is co-opting native elites through assimilation and bribery. And I'm not saying that's exactly what's happened, but we do have a small amount of our people making all the decisions on behalf of everyone without good consultation. And, you know, the method of divide and rule, and I couldn't help but involve John Minto in this, and his quote when talking about the Himātao: divide and rule is the first choice of weapon of government, and the second, the police, and the third is the army. Ironically, another phone call from our local police about 6 p.m. tonight asking, is there going to be a protest and occupation? In which case I just said, look, whatever anyone decides, I'm sure it will be legal and peaceful, but I can't guarantee anything. So, you know, Rocket Lab are nervous. People are nervous. They recognise there is people gathering. They recognise there's people talking, asking questions, and perhaps Rocket Lab haven't, you know, carried the favours that they thought they had at an earlier time. This is a pretty busy slide. I couldn't help but do this one. This is the book dated March 2021 that came out at the recent Hui. So they have a series of Hui usually pre-launch, and we're coming up to a launch window now with the payload Ollie talked about earlier. So they talk about Rocket Lab partners with Tawapata South Incorporation. So they've partnered with some trustees of the incorporation. Hand on heart, I can't say they've partnered with the incorporation as a whole or shareholders. And I can see why it's attractive. Farming, particularly farms and marginal parts of the coastline, aren't big profit-making entities. So you don't make a lot of money from farming. And with a large shareholding like that, people can't expect to get a large dividend. So, and it was a time also where the block had a mortgage. So, you know, $50,000 per launch, and also the other payments, that does look attractive. Job creation, yes, they have created some jobs. I think would like to challenge some of the figures that they've produced. And maybe it's semantics. I don't believe they employ many tangata whenua at all. they quote large numbers of locals. Either the numbers are out of date, or they have a generous definition of what a local might be. Education grants, so they also talk about the education grants in there. Those are now advertised nationally and they're open to applicants across the country. It was very much set up for initially for local people with strong connections to Mahia and the wider district. However, I think it was the 2009 recipient didn't have any connections, and a number of Wairoa applicants who successfully went on to tertiary study were applicants of that scholarship, but for whatever reason that was not seen as either enough applicants or good enough. We don't really know, and I guess that's that lack of transparency. It's going to be a struggle for Wairoa catchment to compete against national numbers of applicants. So I'm not entirely sure what Rocket Lab's intention is there. Community sponsorship, they support local basketball team. $6,000 of proceeds of a patch for the sale of the shore plover, the Tuturu Atu, has been donated to DOC, apparently. They talk about volunteering for DOC, but then many local people volunteer for DOC too. So, yeah, not going to go into that much further. Sponsorship, fishing, golf club. They talk about caring for our environment, and they highlight the fuel, water, waste, soil sampling. But no wastewater reports have been made available. No soil testing has been made available. They've initially denied issues around vibration to homes during launches, then later said there were slight issues. And it is Tangata Whenua that have been asking for these things. It was Tangata Whenua initially who supplied some of the reports and risk assessments. And they have been repeatedly asking for these things, and I don't believe those have been forthcoming. So one of the truths I put on there, on the Waiwahine people, they are warm and generous. Rocket Lab did note that, and I just want to mihi to them around that. How can outsiders help? So Mahia whānau the most affected, although this is of national interest. So some of the whānau talked about maybe expertise being offered. There is a lot of technical language and jargon, particularly at the Rocket Lab meetings. They bring about 5 people with them, spokespeople, technical experts. Legal advice. Legal advice might be a good thing, particularly as we move through other actions. Independent environmental support. So if Rocket Lab are not going to supply those reports, are they open that iwi, Tangata Whenua actually can send people themselves to collect that data? Tech support. Just like tonight, I'm pretty proud of some of our whānau, their first Zoom, and pulling together to make it happen. So from time to time, some tech support to keep networking. Possibly build a research team to look into the payloads, and that's part of that expertise. And as Ollie mentioned earlier, there's a big unknown factor there. I've highlighted this one in red. Build opposition across Aotearoa, in particular the actions of Labour Minister Stuart Nash and Phil Twyford. So yeah, some political posturing there, so maybe we can extend some might. Support for occupation when and if Tangata Whenua are ready. So how can we offer support there? And perhaps that means donations. Perhaps it's in the form of donations to make some of these things happen. So yeah, that's some of our thoughts there. So yeah, thank you. Thank you for listening to me tonight.
Kia ora, thank you so much, Sonya, and thank you, Ollie. We've got a range of questions that are really for both of you. So I guess I just want to start off by asking, we've talked a lot about military payloads tonight. Obviously, Rocket Lab has launched a lot of private satellites. Ollie, I just wonder, can you talk a little bit about, do those private surveillance satellites raise questions and issues from your perspective?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So as mentioned, yeah, military satellites are one part, and there's a range of other customers. Those include, scientific satellites, satellites for agencies like NASA, which most people wouldn't have a problem with. But the major, I think, area of commercial activity that Rocket Lab, I think, plans to base its business on is a number of private companies that are wanting to make the most of this fairly affordable way of getting to space. So many of these companies are collecting various forms of data of the Earth, and the idea is sending up huge constellations of satellites so that they can collect data of anywhere at the Earth at any time. But I think there are concerns around these satellites. I mean, some people might be concerned just about the fact of the Earth constantly being imaged in that way. I mean, that's not something we really discuss, but is a change that we're heading towards. But a number of these companies, these Earth imaging or remote sensing companies, as they're technically called, are themselves contractors for the US military. So there's a company called Black Sky, for example, which essentially uses predictive algorithms to help provide insights into images of the Earth. So the idea is you collect all this data and then you can make predictions as to what's going to happen where on the Earth at any time. And they sell this data and these services to various military agencies and US intelligence agencies. And so I think this reflects one of the major challenges when it comes to space, which is that there are no clear lines anywhere. The line between military and commercial and military and scientific uses very easily blur. So the fact that something is a private company doesn't necessarily tell you that that's the end of the conversation. As the existence of Rocket Lab demonstrates, it's a private company, but the US military is reliant on it to provide these small launch services.
Great, thank you very much. Sonya, I certainly invite you to comment on that if you like, but I would also just want to ask you to elaborate a bit more about some of the ecological issues that you've raised. You've talked about various monitoring reports. Who is actually responsible for the ecological environmental monitoring that's supposed to be going on out there? Is that being done? And are people in the community being kept informed about what's going on?
So Rocket Labs say that they're self-contained, and so therefore there isn't any wastewater running into the sea, any runoff. So that's what they say. But we have to remember we're not in a high trust relationship with Rocket Lab. And so just saying it and printing it is really not enough. Currently, they're not able to demonstrate that to people or provide those reports. Yeah, soil testing. So that obviously that's important when you're talking about the large amounts of fuel and other heavy elements that they're dealing with, and ensuring that there's no seepage and things aren't running off from there. The shore plover is another thing altogether. So I think the Wairoa, Portland Island, is the biggest population of this particularly rare bird. It's very difficult to get any solid information around the effects or what Rocket Lab should be doing to mitigate any of those effects. There really is nothing there. And so that's about that lack of independence. It's about saying we're done, that Rocket Lab is saying they've done the testing, but they're still not supplying the data. But back to your original question, who's responsible? There's iwi groups across the Wairoa district and Mahia that have taken on some independent testing. And, Rocket Lab, if they started to listen to people, that could be an option. But really people have been locked out.
Thanks very much. There's a couple of questions from people about legal avenues, and perhaps Ollie, this is a question for you to hold the New Zealand government accountable for the kind of decisions. What are those possible avenues? And I guess kind of part of that is, how would policy be developed about kind of whether a launch was or was not acceptable?
That's a really good question. The question of legally challenging it is a big one, but in terms of the different actors in the legal system that have a say in this, obviously there's the Economic Development Minister, Stuart Nash. He's ultimately the one with the pen making the decision. But in reality, the Space Agency is the body that both develops space policy, but also assesses and approves the payloads. But obviously, the Space Agency as a government entity is responsible to the minister and to the government. The Prime Minister also has a role under the Outer Space Act. She can intervene and veto a launch. And so these, I think, are a range of actors that people could focus on if they're interested in having their voice heard. So, but there's no specific, under the Outer Space Act, there's no specific legal mechanism for people to intervene. So really it just comes down to the same way that I guess people try and have their voices heard by government generally. That's, it's writing to your minister, it's finding ways to let them know. But I think before, on one of the slides from Sonya, there's reference to Phil Twyford. So Phil Twyford is another important person in all of this. He was the relevant minister a while ago, but now he's the Minister for Disarmament. And so there's, I think, clearly a bit of overlap between those portfolios. So I mean, but in terms of more specific legal strategies, I'm not sure I can give any more specific advice from that. But I hope that might give a sense of the kind of spaces where people might apply pressure if they're interested in doing so.
So there's a sort of a legal strategy and potentially political strategy that are sort of slightly different things there, and presumably things like a judicial review might be available to people if they wanted to go down that track. Yes, I mean, the minister operates within a legal framework. He has to take considerations into account, and any decision by the government is in theory something that a court could challenge. But there's a lot of discretional fluffiness in the law, which I think is a challenge because a court's probably not going to. I mean, I'm just speculating here, so just take it with a grain of salt. But you're right, Valerie, that's another form of oversight that exists, is through the courts. Yeah, not one that's necessarily proved that effective for activists in the past, but yeah. We'll turn to another question. There's a question: does anyone know how many of the trustees are employed by Rocket Lab?
Yeah, that's the question I'd like answered. I know that a number of trustees have been flown to Auckland and been to Rocket Lab HQ, I guess you'd call it, and looked after in relation to that. In terms of how many on the payroll, I can't answer that question, and I'm not sure any of us would know.
Ollie, did you have anything that you wanted to add in respect to that?
Not particularly. I mean, I know that there's people, shareholders. I know of one board member who I think has done work for them, not as an employee, but as a contractor. And I think a lot of people have told me things about different board members working for the company in various ways, but I haven't seen any kind of evidence of that to say whether or not it's true. So I think I would agree with Sonya that that's in the category of the unknowns at this point.
I guess there is one question that people are asking, what is Peter Beck's relationship himself with the US military? What more do we know about that?
Yeah, so it's an interesting story. So back in 2008, when Rocket Lab was, really just beginning, Peter Beck and a man called Mark Rocket, who was then a financial backer and co-director in the company, did an interview where they said they had no interest in doing any military work because they weren't interested in killing people. But obviously something's changed, and Peter Beck has now justifies the military work, although Mark Rocket left the company in 2011 because he didn't want to participate in that work. So, I mean, the nature of the relationship with the US military, well, I mean, it's the same as Rocket Lab's relationship in that he's the director of the company. He really is the vision and the driving force behind it. So certainly, the fact that there's investment from military or from at least the CIA's venture capital firm indicates a relationship there. Peter Beck has spoken at a summit of that firm. So certainly, and also Rocket Lab representatives have attended meetings that we're aware of with US intelligence and military agencies, as you would expect if they're launching their satellites. So there's definitely a relationship there. How committed he is personally, I couldn't say. I can say that early on, when there was first discussion around these military launches, when I first started reporting on it, the response from Rocket Lab was very much like, well, we're not really going to talk about it, or we'll emphasize the benefits to society from launching military satellites. So the idea that if we launch this, the technology might benefit society generally later on. But in recent times, Peter Beck has been interviewed and said, and kind of made the case that this is about our military relationship with the United States and that New Zealand benefits from that. So I think that's, his view seems to be that that this is good for New Zealand's national security.
Thanks very much. Sonya, a question, I guess a comment from you. Someone has written, Kia ora, I attended the first hui rangomai wahine held at Tuahuru Marae several years ago, and they have broken practically every assurance they gave us. Do you want to comment on that?
Look, I just want to mahi to you and what you've just relayed. That's pretty much how everybody feels right across the board. And the only people that I see in the camp that are pro-rockets is people that are excited about economy, employment, and maybe the trustees to the block. To be honest, the tide's sort of turned the other way. Everyone feels, deep distrust. So things have been misrepresented. There's definitely a really strong sales pitch. When I read this, this is really a sales document to say that we're good and we're doing great things and work with people in the community. But clearly that's not what's happening on the ground.
Thank you, Sonya. And I just want to invite the moderator to flick through a few of those links before we close. Again, for the petition, for the link to Rocket Lab and the sign up, so that people can continue to stay in touch with us as we carry on, I guess, with this campaign. One of the final questions someone's asked is, the resource consent was rushed. Are there grounds to have this reviewed?
Just to speak to the context of that, and I'm sure Sonya can add more to that. So yeah, the resource so there's a number with resource consent. There's a number of layers to it. From the Wairoa District Council, there's a building consent and a consent to conduct activities. In the Hawke's Bay Regional Council granted the consent for the various discharges and all of that. They did have the Wairoa District Council one happened very quickly, and they deemed it non-notifiable, so there didn't need to be public consent. I'm certainly not an expert at all in resource management law, but I would say there's issues with that whole legal regime, so I wouldn't be particularly optimistic about it. And you know, if you read the documents, it appears as if all the boxes have been ticked. So I think while there's definitely concerns that the community has that I can very much understand from a legal perspective, you know, who knows? So that's not a very helpful answer, sorry.
Yeah, I'm pretty much in the same camp as Ollie. So certainly there's lots of people that can make a formal approach to the council to ensure that any variations to the consent are notifiable. And so that, you know, I could write and say, you have to notify me, I'm an affected party. And that's certainly something that didn't happen the first time round. And there's certainly people in Mahia have taken that action, which is great. There's a former district councillor registered tonight who's very good at process, so it'd be great to talk to her maybe offline later about any experiences she's had. But I'm a little bit with Ollie in that, not to sound defeatist, they have probably done this legally. Did they follow the law, the LORE? No. Was it ethical? No, but I suspect it's legal. And so this might be an area where somebody with a little more expertise could offer some support.
Thank you both. I must admit, Sonya, when you discussed the provincial growth funding for the road out there, I was shocked, and I'm sure that many of the listeners tonight were absolutely shocked. Anybody who's ever spent any time anywhere in that community, anywhere near there, knows most of the roads are in terrible condition, and that there's a huge need for so many things in that community, which are not a $6 million road out to the tip of the peninsula. So it certainly seems like that there is a great deal of stuff that's going on behind closed doors that is not really in the interest of the people of Mahia, and more generally not really in the interest of the people of Aotearoa and perhaps ultimately the world. So I just would really like to say thank you so much to you, Sonya, and to all of the people involved with Rocket Lab Monitor, to all of the people in Mahia who are getting organized and getting educated around this issue. And I think for the listeners tonight who are interested in carrying on with getting involved, there are lots of opportunities. Sonya has outlined a whole lot of opportunities of help that is needed, of expertise that's needed. There'll be need for bodies on the ground when the time comes, when people are ready to take that action, and we will be there to support them. So sign up to the mailing list, get onto Rocket Lab Monitor's Facebook page. And I just really want to say a great big thanks to you, Sonya, and to Ollie for your huge amount of knowledge and expertise. Thank you so much for sharing with us tonight. And kia ora to everyone for being on the call with us tonight. Thank you so much, everybody. Ka kite anō.